Well, to kick things off, Dr. Wentz, I've heard your name across so many different podcasts, and I love everything you do. I love your mission. I was like, I need to have her on the show because I have yet to talk about thyroid and adrenal health in my 2 years of doing this podcast. And this is certainly a topic that a lot of women, in particular, struggle with. So I'd love to just do, a whole episode again dedicated to this. It's going to be probably the first of many because there's so much to cover within the hour. But with that, Dr. Wentz, I'd love to just kick things off in asking, how did you find yourself in this space?
Well, in full disclosure, I was never interested in the thyroid space, I guess, or thyroid disorders during pharmacy school. I took a 1-hour lecture about thyroid disorders where we covered hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism, which is underactive and overactive. And I thought they were just these boring conditions that people developed sometime in their lives and that the treatment options were pretty straightforward. It wasn't until I was diagnosed myself with Hashimoto's after 10 years of mystery symptoms ranging from irritable bowel syndrome to hair loss to acid reflux to debilitating fatigue and panic attacks, where I realized that the current treatment approaches for hypothyroidism, most of which is caused by an autoimmune condition known as Hashimoto's, were just very underwhelming. So in conventional medicine, essentially, if you have an autoimmune attack against your thyroid gland, you do nothing. You just kind of wait until it destroys your thyroid, and then you can start taking thyroid hormones.
Replacement, all that fun stuff.
And I really was I was in my 20s. I was why am I having an autoimmune condition? This oftentimes happens to women later in life, right? What have I done in my life to bring this on? And is there anything I can do to make myself feel better? Because although I took the medications, they were not working. And then I soon discovered from patient forums and other patient advocates that most people actually that took the thyroid medications still did not feel better. And so I started just really peeling back the layers of the onion and figuring out what was contributing to my autoimmune condition and figuring out how to get myself to feel better. So I would say I became a Hashimoto's and thyroid expert by ways of being a human guinea pig because I just wanted to feel better when I was in my 20s.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. Going back to symptoms, so you mentioned a few pretty debilitating symptoms. In terms of testing, Dr. Wentz, and I know obviously a conventional, testing approach probably differs from a more integrative testing approach, but what are some of the things that, patients should be looking for in terms of blood work to see if they have Hashimoto's or other thyroid disorders?
This is such an important question because a lot of times people might hear about thyroid symptoms like hair loss or fatigue or weight gain or cold intolerance, and they will go see their doctors and ask for their thyroid to be tested. But if doctors only do one typical test, the thyroid screening test, so many cases are missed. And so conventional medicine will typically recommend a screening test, which is known as TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. When this is elevated, that means that your body doesn't have enough thyroid hormone on board because the TSH is released by the pituitary, and this means basically that the pituitary has sensed that the body needs to produce more thyroid hormone. And so oftentimes people who have had thyroid disease for 5, 10, 15 years will have an elevated TSH. Now, here's the problem with this screening test. One is a lot of times the reference ranges are overly lax. So a woman of childbearing age should have a TSH somewhere right around 1. Where I know I had done this test and my levels were 4.5 or 5, and doctors were like, oh, this is considered normal. This isn't an issue, where I felt like a sloth, right? But the reference ranges have been as lax as up to 10, depending on what lab you do, where really if you do not have a thyroid condition, your thyroid function, your TSH should be somewhere between 0.5 and 2. The other issue is the TSH can fluctuate in the early stages of the condition, maybe the first 5 to 10 years. So one day it might show up high, and then the thyroid gland begins to compensate, and then it might show up normal, and then the next day it might actually show too low. And so depending on the day you test, you might miss the condition. And then the third reason is essentially because you have this autoimmune destruction against your thyroid, and the TSH isn't going to pick that up. And so the tests I actually recommend are going to be thyroid peroxidase antibodies and thyroglobulin antibodies. And if somebody's taking notes, I would just say write TPO and TG antibodies, and your doctor will know what those are. And these are indicators that your body has recognized the thyroid gland as a foreign invader of some sort and is launching an autoimmune attack against the thyroid. And so these are elevated for 5, 10, 15 years before you'll see a change in TSH. And they can be responsible for a lot of symptoms. And when you have them, you can start really addressing your health. Many cases get rid of all of your symptoms, lower the antibodies to undetectable limits, and then prevent the need for thyroid hormone. And some people, even with those elevated antibodies, they actually might need to start thyroid hormone depending if, for example, they're trying to conceive or already are very symptomatic. So they're just really, really good information to know.
Yeah. I'm taking notes as you're talking. So if our TSH is between 0.5 and 2, that doesn't necessarily require us having to go to do like a TPO and TG test.
I would still do it just because if your TSH is between 0.5 and 2, it could just be the day that you tested it. It might have came.
Oh, interesting.
Because that TSH can fluctuate in the first 5 to 10 years.
Right.
Then the other tests would be your actual thyroid hormones. So free T3 and free T4 are the levels of thyroid hormones we have in our blood that could be tested, because sometimes there's a communication breakdown between the pituitary and what's actually going on in the body. And so I've seen people that have low actual thyroid hormones, low T3, low T4, but their pituitary is not sensing that, and they might have a normal or even a suppressed TSH. And then last but not least would be reverse T3 it's kind of a weird name, but it's non-thyroidal thyroid illness. So essentially you have thyroid symptoms, but they're probably not coming from your thyroid per se. They're usually coming from a nutrient deficiency or that stress component, like adrenal dysfunction can drive your reverse T3. And then typically I see if somebody is anemic, they can have high reverse T3, and they'll have every thyroid symptom in the book, but they won't have those thyroid antibodies, and they will have a normal TSH. And then everybody's like scratching their heads that isn't functionally trained, wondering like, why does this person have every symptom in the book, but not an actual thyroid condition? And it's essentially how your body utilizes and converts thyroid hormones. Reverse T3 will tell you if you have high levels of it, that essentially your body is blocking your actual thyroid hormones' ability to interact with your thyroid hormone receptors.
Interesting. And the free T3 and T4, does that also vary across like the span of 10 years? Or if someone takes it at a snapshot in time and it's normal, can we pretty much accurately say that like they're within a normal range? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it depends, because so what's happening in the early stages of thyroid dysfunction, you would have let's say your thyroid gland is under attack by the immune system, and so a part of it is damaged. But when that TSH raises up, this is actually a signal to the thyroid to make more thyroid hormones. And so then the thyroid gland overcompensates and starts making more hormones. And it can do that for a while where it overcompensates. So like, let's say you have a part of it that's damaged, but then the non-damaged part just kind of goes into hyperdrive, right? And so the T3 and T4 levels can fluctuate. And then when at a certain point, when advanced conditions, they're just always going to be low unless you add in more thyroid hormone. And that's typically when your thyroid gland is damaged to the point where it can't compensate anymore.
So interesting.
And that's when you're diagnosed, but it's like this it's happening for like 5, 10, 15 years.
Yeah. I was going to say, like, what's the average, I guess, like age where women actually are diagnosed with it? You said like it could happen on later in life typically.
Well, it's tricky because I find that a lot of women are diagnosed in like perimenopause. So typically, age 35 to 50. is when they get that diagnosis, and they have more of a classical presentation where they have that weight gain, right?
Right.
And a lot of times for women, that's a red flag, or weight gain or hair loss, that I need to really get a comprehensive checkup. And
Right.
doctors are really taught to look for that. In my case, for example, I had been losing weight, and that can happen in the early stages of thyroid dysfunction. And then in younger women, they can actually present this way. And my doctor was like, one of my two doctors was like, oh my gosh, I would have never suspected that this was what was going on with you. I'm going to actually look at my other patients now, my younger patients, and test their function thoroughly, because I just didn't realize how it can present differently in different people. So the diagnosis might happen later on in life, but the condition can be happening in younger women. So typically what I'll see is people that were very moody teenagers. That can be a sign of thyroid dysfunction, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder. These are all associated with early thyroid dysfunction when you have those high thyroid antibodies. And then women in their 20s, they might present with symptoms like irritable bowel syndrome. And 25% of people with irritable bowel syndrome actually have hypothyroidism, according to one study. That early
Interesting.
stage. Then women get a little bit, maybe 25 to 35, and maybe they want to start families, and they have multiple miscarriages and they can't get pregnant. And this is oftentimes due to thyroid dysfunction. But it really breaks my heart, because I wish every moody teenager, I wish every woman with IBS, and I wish every woman that was thinking about having a baby would have her thyroid function tested, because it is very much underdiagnosed. I think these days we are seeing more diagnoses.
I was just going to ask you that.
Yeah. I think we're raising a lot more awareness now, and women are advocating for themselves. People listen to podcasts, they have TikTok, they have social media, and we're better able to advocate for ourselves. But I know when I was in my 20s, and I was in pharmacy school, so you would think I would have a little bit more knowledge than the average person. But still, I was not getting the correct testing done, and I went undiagnosed for probably 10 to 15 years. And I had all of these symptoms that doctors were like, oh, you're a college student, you're stressed out. College students are stressed out, therefore you're going to have X, Y, and Z. I really do wish diagnoses were happening earlier. At this rate, I think 1 in 5 women will be diagnosed at some point in their lives with hypothyroidism. And generally speaking, they do get diagnosed a little bit later in life, where unfortunately many of them have been struggling for 5 to 10 years before they get that diagnosis.
Yeah. Is that a condition that's reversible?
It is, if you catch it early. So if you catch it early enough, you can absolutely get rid of your symptoms. You can get those thyroid antibodies to such a low range that your thyroid is essentially able to, it's like the body's always being destroyed and it's fixing itself, right? There's like a fine balance there. When the thyroid antibodies are very high, or there's an aggressive autoimmune attack against the thyroid gland, the body can't keep up with like that cell turnover. And so you get to a point where you're just going to have more and more damage. If you get them low enough, then you're not going to have that progression to needing thyroid hormone, and you're not going to have the symptoms. So there's 5 stages to Hashimoto's, and I would say the 4th stage is typically when people are diagnosed. If you're in stage 2 or 3, it's generally going to be more reversible.
Very interesting. So with that, Dr. Wentz, what are some lifestyle modifications that folks could take to hopefully reverse that condition?
One of the biggest things is going to be focusing on nutrition, and this is something that most people can do themselves in their own homes, is figuring out if you have triggering foods. For about 88% of the people I've worked with, gluten tends to be a really big trigger. About 80% of people, they might also be sensitive to dairy proteins. And then somewhere in between that, blood sugar issues, blood sugar imbalances. So you might be somebody that has, if you're eating like a high carbohydrate diet, aka the standard Western diet, standard American diet, switching your diet around to have more fat and more protein, less processed carbs, less processed food overall can really dramatically impact the thyroid antibodies and the thyroid symptoms really in a pretty relatively short amount of time, sometimes 5 to 7 days, where people will just start seeing, wow, I feel more calm, and they can actually start testing their thyroid antibodies and seeing how they can get lowered within a few weeks. And then the other thing I advocate for people to look into doing themselves, and oftentimes it helps to have a doctor, but you don't always need one, is making sure your nutrient status is addressed. Vitamin D deficiency is a really, really big common root cause of autoimmune conditions. Most of my ladies who have Hashimoto's in remission, we aim for vitamin D levels to be between 60 and 80. I know a lot of times people get tested and it might be like 29 or 30 or 31, and their doctors are like, this is fine, this is normal.
Right.
We do want to make sure we address that. Making sure addressing any kind of anemia or iron deficiency. Iron is really important for proper utilization of thyroid hormone. And I do see some women, they actually become hypothyroid because of a longstanding anemia. And so getting your ferritin tested would be the first step, and making sure that's somewhere in the 90 to 100 range is another important thing I recommend. And then looking into B12 deficiency, this is another common co-occurring deficiency. Generally, levels you want to have around 700. These are things you want to test and not really guess, right? And then there's other nutrients you can take supportively, such as selenium. That's been found to reduce thyroid antibodies in the range of 83 micrograms to 200 micrograms a day. Myo-inositol, when combined with selenium in the early stages, can normalize thyroid function and get people into remission, just those two nutrients alone.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard about inositol, I mean, primarily in the use for women with PCOS, and it's been very, very helpful. With selenium too, Dr. Wentz, are you a fan of Brazil nuts? Like, could that be a good supplement, or rather substitute for a selenium supplement, or are you a fan of just supplementing with an actual like selenium supplement?
That's a good question. I get why people would want to use Brazil nuts, but I would say from all the people that I've worked with, if they're doing Brazil nuts and we test their thyroid antibodies, they don't really move the needle. When we do an actual like dose titrated supplement, because it's a narrow therapeutic index nutrient, so you need to have just the right amounts for it to work. When you have amounts that are above, then it's not really gonna it's toxic, right? And so I will see people use selenium at like 200 micrograms within 3 months. I can predict that their thyroid antibodies are going to go down by 40 to 50%. If they're eating 2 Brazil nuts a day in 3 months, I can't guarantee that. You know what I mean? So it's I wish it was like that. And I know I get kind of like, okay, people try to make clever, fun videos about using food. And I love food as medicine. And I love clean organic foods and getting your nutrients from food. But sometimes you just really need to be precise with these things, right?
Yeah. All right. So then in terms of supplements for thyroid health, so you mentioned myo-inositol, selenium, vitamin B, B12.
B12, magnesium can be a really big game changer. Long-term studies have shown that using magnesium citrate long-term can normalize the thyroid gland.
Interesting.
On an ultrasound. It's usually a few years of using it, but I really like that form for a lot of women that tend to be constipated, that have menstrual cramps, anxiety, insomnia, sleep issues. It does make a really big difference for them.
So interesting. In terms of a timeline, Dr. Wentz, like after, abiding by these lifestyle modifications, changing your diet, introducing these supplements, when can women expect to see a turnaround? And I know obviously this, may vary, but just in general, like how many months would you say?
It's been really interesting for me to work with a lot of women and see the timelines that they're on. Sometimes when you change your diet or initiate a supplement, you could see symptom resolution in like 3 to 5 days. It's really, really incredible. Sometimes you get that one thing that really moves the needle. And I found that to be the case with gluten-free diet, dairy-free diet, Sometimes a thiamine supplement for fatigue can turn that around very, very quickly. Magnesium can work relatively quickly too. But generally speaking, I would give people 1 to 3 months to see the full benefits and the full effects of their interventions. People can start testing their thyroid antibodies as well within, I would say 1 to 3 months, and see a trend to see if those are reducing with time. Because a lot of things do take some time, but I would say if it's been 3 months and you're doing things and you're not seeing a difference, it's time to get on a new plan.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. One other question for you. You mentioned adrenals before, and I'm so curious, what is the connection between our adrenal health and thyroid function?
The body works as a whole, so there's this feedback loop between our adrenals and thyroid gland, and a lot of our other hormones have these feedback loops built in. The thyroid gland and adrenals have a very intimate relationship, where if we don't have enough thyroid hormone on board, then our cortisol clearance, which is one of the main hormones made by the adrenals, will slow down. So then our body will sort of keep more cortisol around. And it's kind of like, okay, thyroid gives you energy, cortisol gives you energy. You don't have enough thyroid, so the body's like, I'm going to kick in and give you some of that extra cortisol. Now, unfortunately, cortisol energy is kind of like I drank 8 cups of coffee.
Right.
Right. When you have too much of it. And so a lot of times we'll see that connection where women will have excess cortisol levels when they're hypothyroid. And then the tricky part is when a woman gets thyroid hormone replacement, oftentimes their cortisol production their cortisol clearance will normalize, and then they end up being cortisol deficient. So they'll be like, okay, well, I started thyroid hormone and I thought I was going to feel better. Initially I did, but now all of a sudden I'm very tired and I just kind of crashed. Cortisol is something I commonly see in women with thyroid dysfunction. Oftentimes adrenals are like our stress glands. And so a lot of excessive stress can bring on autoimmunity and thyroid dysfunction. And I guess all that to say, you generally speaking, if you're supporting a person's thyroid, you also, I would say 9 out of 10 times, you do need to support their adrenal health as well to make sure that their output of adrenal hormones is properly balanced, that their stress response is balanced.
Here's a question for you. Let's say someone's cortisol is very elevated from a blood test. And I'm curious again of your thoughts on proper testing for cortisol, because obviously I think that, that one prick in the morning for a blood test might result in probably higher than anticipated cortisol levels. So I know there are those 24-hour cortisol tests, but let's say someone's cortisol levels are very elevated, but their free T3, free T4, TSH, everything else looks normal. What would you think of that?
I would really dig deeper into why the cortisol was elevated in the morning. So generally speaking, your cortisol should be higher in the morning than it's going to be throughout the rest of the day. But if on a blood test it's coming up high, that could suggest a condition maybe like Cushing's or perhaps like the early stages of it. Maybe they're overusing things like caffeine. Maybe there's some chronic stress going on. And I would definitely follow through with that to get screened and ruled out for Cushing's disease. And if that comes back normal, there's also more, I guess, nuanced cortisol patterns that can happen, which is more of the functional medicine realm. And that would typically be either like a saliva test or a Dutch test. And then you could look at like what your body is putting out throughout the day. Sometimes I'll see people with very high cortisol in the morning, and then they kind of crash later on in the day. Sometimes I see people with high cortisol all day. Sometimes people have low cortisol in the morning and high cortisol at night. And then we can use substances to like adjust cortisol levels directly. So there are things like phosphatidylserine to lower the cortisol. We can also use things like hydrocortisone or licorice drops to increase the cortisol directly. And that can be helpful, but what I really like to do is essentially focus on stress reduction, because that will help whether your cortisol is high, low, bouncing all around the place. And things like making sure you get bright light exposure throughout the day, that you're avoiding blue lights after
Yeah.
sunset, you're getting really good sleep at night. These are going to be really good key steps to balancing that cortisol pattern. Cortisol is very, very adaptive to our circadian rhythm. And so when we are not in balance with that, when we spend a lot of time indoors, right? I have recording a podcast and I have this bright light on me and I'm in a brightly lit room, but the lights that are outside are so much more powerful and they let your eyes and your brain know that it's time to rise and shine and be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. When people miss that message from the sun, they end up sometimes being chronically fatigued because of it and having insomnia because your body just doesn't have kind of a compass to let you know when it's day or nighttime.
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. That those first 10 minutes of morning sun exposure have become a staple for me, Dr. Wentz. Like if I do not get my morning sun exposure, I feel it throughout the day. It just, and again, people think if it's cloudy outside, they're not going to get the same benefit. But I'm like, no, the sun's rays still shine through the clouds. Just go outside.
I've had some very skeptical clients that are like, this sounds so basic. There's no way this can help my fatigue and insomnia. And I'm like, please just try it. And they're like, yeah, this was pretty basic, but it actually does help. And it's just the way we're wired is we get these messages. When I was a young pharmacist, I remember having some clients with cortical blindness. And they essentially, when you have this, you can't receive the messages from the sun through your retinas, and then you don't end up producing melatonin at the right times. So these clients, they really struggled with sleep, right? And so they had to put on melatonin at bedtime to let their bodies know it was time for sleep. But our bodies do that naturally, unless we have some kind of a genetic disorder or something that we're born with that prevents us from doing that.
Yeah, so interesting. And I know that the term like adrenal fatigue, right, is not technically like accepted in the conventional realm. Is that still true?
Well, I think it's very confusing because there is adrenal insufficiency, which is a conventional medical term used to describe like Addison's disease, where your adrenals are damaged and they're not able to produce cortisol. This is a life-threatening condition. And this is not the same as like this adrenal fatigue, which was coined by a naturopathic doctor 2+ years ago. I think what he was meaning to, his theory was that there was something wrong with the adrenals and that's why they weren't putting out cortisol. With more research being done on this, it seems like it's more of a hypothalamic pituitary axis dysfunction where basically your adrenals are healthy, but they're not receiving the message from the pituitary to make cortisol at the right times. And one of the things that can bring this on is actually like long-term trauma or childhood trauma or any of these kind of adverse childhood events. They can bring on this disconnection. But even things like having excess stress, overworking, over-exercising, not sleeping enough, under-eating, a lot of these things can actually bring that about as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you touched on exercise because this is certainly a very nuanced area as well. And I know folks have very strong opinions on this, but let's say for the woman out there who is looking to recover her adrenal health and who also has thyroid issues, because as you said, they're both intimately related, what would a proper exercise regimen look like for her?
This is going to depend on where she is in that adrenal journey. So a lot of times women might start off with high cortisol levels. And for these individuals, doing things like exercise that's high intensity or aerobic exercise, like running, this can actually help to lower those cortisol levels and bring you back into balance. Now, on the flip side of that, a lot of the women that I work with autoimmunity, chronic fatigue syndrome, Hashimoto's, fibromyalgia, hypothyroidism, they might be on the other spectrum where they have low cortisol. And these amazing high-intensity aerobic exercises and running are going to make them feel more depleted and worse. And so for them, things like strength training or yoga or even like foregoing exercise and getting more rest for not for the rest of their lives, right? Just for a time period, maybe a 4-week reset might be the answer. And I think one of the things you can do is you can test your cortisol. to see where you're at and see which protocol would work best for you. And the other thing you can do is just really listen to your body. It's like you should be feeling good after exercise. Yeah, you might be sore and you might feel tender, but you should feel accomplished. You shouldn't feel like I just need to take 3 days to recover
Right.
from this.
Right.
And that's kind of a rule of thumb, is checking in with your body.
Yeah.
I know that's tricky because for many of us, we've conditioned to quiet our bodies. If we're in pain, we take painkillers. If our body is, allergic to something, trying to tell us something in our environment's not working, we take allergy meds and so on and so forth. So sometimes it can be tricky to make that connection, because some women might think they actually have high cortisol when they have low cortisol, and vice versa.
Right. What would a high cortisol level look like numerically?
It's going to depend on the testing that you do. And so it's going to depend on whether you do saliva, urine, or blood test.
Let's say blood.
What's that?
Blood test.
Let me see here.
I know there's different ranges, but just in general. And interestingly too, I know obviously if you test with the more like functional lab, the range is obviously less, right, than what you would have for a conventional lab.
Yeah, with like a blood test that you would get, I would defer to the lab that you're going to get and see what your reference ranges are going to be. So you would actually get a lab test, and I always advocate for that. And it would say high, right?
Right.
So it would let you know if it was high or not. And I would defer that to your doctor to see if that's something that might be a one-off, or if you really need to do more testing for something like Cushing's disease. With the functional testing, I will say it's a little bit tricky, because I've worked with a few companies over the last years where the way that the companies can set up is let's say they have a whole bunch of values, and then they'll set the normal reference ranges. And then they get a whole bunch of values from people who have low cortisol. Then the reference ranges may adjust. So things that I've worked with, I would be able to say, look at a lab test and it would be abnormal. And then I would be able to talk to a person and they'd be like, yes, I'm feeling this way, I'm feeling this way. And the ranges would correlate. But when some of the labs redo their reference ranges, I would be like, yeah, this test says you're normal, but you're clearly not feeling normal.
Right.
I sometimes like to use ZRT lab for adrenal saliva and the Dutch test for the urine testing, and follow their reference ranges for the most part. But I also would give people an assessment. So I would say, do you have trouble waking up in the morning? Or are you sluggish in the morning? If you do, that's typically going to let me know that you have low cortisol.
Right.
If you have trouble sleeping at night, for example, that's going to let me know that you generally probably have high cortisol. And so if the test doesn't reflect that, then I'm asking questions. For example, did you just drink a whole bunch of coffee before you took your saliva test when you woke up? Or, was there something out of your routine that you did at bedtime? Because you're telling me that you sleep just fine, but this is coming up high. So it's a little bit of I would say like a bit of an art and science. And these days, a lot of what I've started doing with clients is I actually have them do an assessment, because I've had this experience of giving people like functional medicine lab kits, and it's like they sit at their house for 3 years. And I'm like, an assessment, then we could figure out what's out of that. And then we could start making some lifestyle changes, because a lot of the lifestyle changes are going to be the same, whether you have high or low cortisol. It's like your cortisol gets dysregulated because of stress or inflammation. And so let's focus on stress and inflammation.
Right. And that makes complete sense. You mentioned caffeine. This is something I struggle with. I used to be a 2-3 cup caffeine coffee person every morning. I'm trying to cut back, but would you recommend perhaps completely omitting caffeine for someone who's suffering from adrenal insufficiency or adrenal fatigue?
I think for people that have high cortisol, it can increase their cortisol further. For people who have low cortisol, it can actually be kind of therapeutic. And so I know when I first started working with people, I would be like, let's give your body a reset and get off of that caffeine.
Yeah.
And then I would have some very angry clients that would be like, I just feel worse now. Thank you. Like, and I have like no caffeine and I'm still fatigued.
Yeah.
So I do think caffeine can interfere with some of that circadian rhythm. And what my goal for most people is, I wouldn't say you need to quit cold turkey, because I have tried that and it can backfire, is a lot of times we work on getting their energy levels up first, and then we focus on how do we get you into a healthy relationship with caffeine. And so that might mean 1 or 2 cups of coffee in the morning when your cortisol is supposed to be high, but then you cut it off before 3 p.m. Some people it's noon, so it doesn't affect your sleep.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, I feel like most people should be able to tolerate 1 to 2 cups of coffee per day or caffeine per day, once we support these other systems in their bodies.
Yeah.
Some people do need to go off of caffeine, but I wouldn't do it cold turkey. Generally speaking, I would do like a gradual reduction.
That makes sense. In terms of supplements, Dr. Wentz, what are some of your favorite supplements for adrenal fatigue? I'm a huge fan of adaptogens. I found like ashwagandha has certainly helped me over the past few years, but do you have any favorites?
I love the ABCs for adrenal support. These include adaptogenic herbs, like ashwagandha is one of my favorites. Lemon balm, holy basil, or tulsi are some of the other ones I like to use. Sometimes reishi is really great as well for people that might have trouble sleeping, for example, and they don't want to take something too stimulating but need a little bit of an energy boost. Then there's the B vitamins, which include thiamine, B5, B6, all of these can be incredibly helpful for our adrenals and our neurotransmitters. And then high dose vitamin C is like fuel for our adrenals, and that can be incredibly helpful for many people with supporting their immune function and energy levels. So these would be like a great
Interesting.
start for most people.
When you say high dose, do you mean like liposomal vitamin C, or does it matter the form we take it in?
I'm not too picky about the form. For some people, they do like orange juice, and that even helps them. Generally speaking, something above 500 milligrams per day is going to be helpful for people.
Interesting. First thing that came to mind when you said orange juice was those afternoon adrenal cocktails. Have you tried those? Have clients, your patients tried those and found those helpful?
Oh my gosh, I love them. So we have an adrenal kickstart that we recommend for people who are struggling with that morning fatigue, and it has orange juice. It's got a little bit of coconut milk to support blood sugar balance, some electrolytes, and a little bit of sea salt. And I also I have this electrolyte blend that has high levels of vitamin C in it. And
Interesting.
So it tastes like an orange creamsicle. People never.
I love that. Is that a brand, or do you make it yourself?
The electrolyte blend.
Yes.
It's from Rurkology. You can use any electrolytes you want, and you can also use vitamin C powder. And then you would just get organic orange juice, maybe some organic coconut milk. I also like to add a little bit of protein powder, like hydrolyzed beef vanilla protein, to really just give yourself a nice morning smoothie that gives you protein, fat, it's blood sugar balancing, gives you that vitamin C, gives you some of that orange juice to support your blood sugar levels so they're not too low. A lot of times people with adrenal issues might have low blood sugar, which everybody's always like, high blood sugar is bad, but a lot of them actually have low blood sugar, and we need healthy amounts of blood sugar to be able to have good energy. So it's delicious, but I wish
so interesting.
I could take it as a product.
I was going to say that would be brilliant.
Yeah.
I love that. And I'm so curious too, Dr. Wentz, what's like your typical like daily regimen when it comes to, first of all, what's on your plate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and supplements that you personally take?
For breakfast, I usually will have like a smoothie, or I might have eggs. For lunch, I would have either a salad with some healthy veggies, or I like soups a lot. So even in the hot, I'll drink some bone broth. And then for dinner, I generally will eat a healthy protein with healthy, like salmon or chicken or grass-fed beef. and then with cooked veggies.
Interesting. Also, too, in terms of fasting, there certainly is a lot of information out there, right, around intermittent fasting. For someone who is looking to recover from adrenal dysfunction, what would you not recommend surpassing in terms of fasting hours?
Depends on the person where they are. Sometimes we have to meet them where they are, and they might have to eat snacks every 2 to 3 hours until we get their blood sugar balance, until we get that fat and protein ratio up and that carb ratio down. Sometimes I even have them put a banana next to their bed when they wake up.
Interesting.
Initially. And then our goal is for them to have a healthy overnight fast, right? And so maybe we move that dinner window smaller. So maybe we move the dinner a little bit earlier in the day. So let's say they were having dinner at 7 or 8. We move that a little bit earlier. We might move that to 6, 5, or 4 initially. But we generally don't want to be doing 3-day water fasts when we have adrenal dysfunction.
Right.
And you really, generally speaking, you kind of want to get into a state where you have more protein and fats if you're eating the standard American diet before you start jumping into intermittent fasting, because that can really backfire if you are somebody that is eating a very carb heavy diet, because you can just get on this blood sugar roller coaster and feel a lot worse.
Yeah. Do you recommend people use CGMs to track blood sugar?
I love CGMs for tracking blood sugar. They can be a really big game changer to see what your body is doing with regard to your food or alcohol intake or even stress. So you might have hypoglycemia, and that could be causing you to wake up in the middle of the night, and then you can say, okay, I need to adjust my bedtime routine, or I need to adjust the way that I eat throughout the day. Or you might be going super high with your blood sugar, depending on some of the foods you eat. I know I've had some clients that were very surprised that rice was spiking their blood sugar, where they thought this was a healthy gluten-free grain for them.
Very interesting. Yeah, I've experimented quite a few times, and I found that things that I, again, thought were healthy, which technically are still healthy, but my body doesn't necessarily have the best reaction to it, like steel cut oats, for example. But again, if you pair it right with a fat or a protein, I'll throw some almond butter in there, and that'll help mitigate the spike. But it's truly about testing at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think you make such a great point, because I think we can get caught up into what's healthy and what's not healthy. And at the end of the day, it really depends on what's healthy for our bodies and how our bodies respond to things. Yes, of course, I will say that having a grass-fed burger is going to be healthier than a McDonald's burger. We can kind of make those generalities, right? Or that organic foods are going to be generally healthier for us than processed foods. But at the same time, it could be a really amazing food for one person, and another person might respond completely differently.
Right. And also, too, you mentioned stress earlier, right? And I feel like sometimes the stress, the orthorexia, is that the term component where you're scared of what to eat? Essentially, the stress of that can be worse than the thing itself. And certainly stress is a big factor behind everything that we're talking about today.
That's so true. I know that can be very challenging for a lot of people when they essentially get to the point where they believe that taking out more foods from their diet is going to cure them. Right. And so they become very much stressed out about living life, going anywhere, leaving their house, going to restaurants, going to visit family and friends. Right. And the worst part is oftentimes it doesn't really help, and they just keep eliminating more foods and more foods, and they just become sicker. We didn't really talk about this, but a lot of times I say, if you're on a clean diet for 3 months and it's not working, it's time to dig a little bit deeper. My book, Hashimoto's Protocol, has some advanced protocols to look into. For example, if you're sensitive to a ton of different foods, besides gluten and dairy, there's a chance that you've got a gut infection. And that gut infection could be causing you to be sensitive to blueberries or seemingly healthy, innocent foods. And sometimes clearing that gut infection can be a big game changer for your thyroid function, your thyroid antibodies, and a ton of your symptoms. And it's not something I would recommend people necessarily do on their own, but they can definitely get educated about that and realize that, hey, this is going to be something very relevant. And there are herbal protocols, medications that people can use to get rid of these infections.
Yeah, over 70%, right, of our immune system is located in our gut. Is that true?
Absolutely. Our gut is quite interesting because it can really impact our autoimmune response.
Yeah. One diet, Dr. Wentz, I did, this was back in 2018. I did the GAPS protocol, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And interestingly enough, I did it because at the time I started breaking out in hives in high school for no apparent reason. Went to a bunch of different allergists. They all were like, oh, it's idiopathic urticaria. Just continue to take your Allegra and your Zyrtec every day, never really addressing the root solution. So I myself dug a bit more into gut health. I actually had the chance to visit Dr. Alessio Fasano at Massachusetts General Hospital because when I lived in Boston, I lived actually right across the street from there. So that was such a fun conversation to sit down and chat with him. And for listeners, he's basically like the founder of what we call, leaky gut syndrome. But as I dove more into that world, Dr. Wentz, I discovered the GAPS diet. And for listeners out there, it's basically like this 6-stage, very intensive diet where it's like an elimination diet, so to speak. But I remember stage 1 was just bone broth and cooked vegetables and, cooked meat. And, you're on it for 2 weeks. And at first you feel horrible, but then you start to see the light at the end of the tunnel. And when I tell you my skin cleared up, like acne wise, my hives disappeared. I never had to go on Allegra again. I was like, there is something to this diet, and there is certainly something to improving our gut health when it comes to addressing, again, allergies, other autoimmune conditions. Not to say everyone has to go on the GAPS diet, but I do think there are elements of that diet, right? And you mentioned bone broth earlier. I'm a huge bone broth enthusiast. I cook my own bone broth in my Instapot. Incorporating fermented foods, probiotics, trying to avoid gluten and dairy. I'm gluten intolerant. So things that, people can start to introduce in their diet if they don't want to go like completely into something as extensive as that. But it was definitely a very interesting and healing experience for me.
That's amazing you were able to heal your skin and hives. I know that can be quite challenging. And I think people are, in this day and age, they're very used to saying like, okay, let's just take more medications for something. And they might say that diets are extreme, right? And in my experience, I mean, I was on 6 or 7 medications in my 20s. I think that's kind of extreme when you think about it. For acid reflux, where it ended up being food sensitivity. And I'd rather, I'm not dairy sensitive anymore, but for a while I was 100% dairy free. And I felt so much better than taking 5 different drugs for acid reflux. I felt amazing just being dairy free.
Right.
And I think it can be intimidating to start on a healing diet. And sometimes people are like, then I can never eat anything I like again. But your taste buds do reset. And a lot of times you get a lot of the foods back. I don't know if that's been your experience with the GAPS diet.
Definitely.
You were able to get a lot of things back, right?
Yeah. The first time I reintroduced fruit, I was like, this tastes like ice cream. Like, it's so extreme, but your taste buds do change and your body certainly adjusts. But I love that.
And it makes sense for long-term health, right? Because if you were to take Benadryl for 20, 30 years, you might end up with some cognitive decline, right? You might end up with a lot of challenges around constipation. The drugs do have side effects. As a pharmacist, I'm a big believer in using medications when appropriate, but when there's a dietary trigger or there's kind of an infectious trigger or some kind of a stress impact, like medications can be amazing Band-Aids for short term, but generally speaking, chronic health conditions, we really need to figure out what's the root cause.
Yeah, going back to the foundations where truly everything's at, right? And I feel like the more and more, the more science and research comes out, the more we're realizing it really is about going back to the foundations, right? Morning sunlight, whole foods, managing stress, keeping it simple.
Absolutely.
I love that. Well, Dr. Wentz, I can't believe we're almost at the hour. Again, I told you I'm going to have you back on at some point because there's so much to discuss, but this was certainly a wonderful foundational debrief, and I'm really excited to share this with listeners. With that, where can they find you?
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure to be here with you. My website is thyroidpharmacist.com, and you can find me across various social media channels under Isabella Wentz or Thyroid Pharmacist. And I actually have a podcast that focuses on thyroid health and reversing various autoimmune conditions. And it's Thyroid Pharmacist Healing Conversations. If you guys want to check that out, it's on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube.
Awesome. Well, I'll be including the links to all of those in the show notes. But my last question for you, Dr. Wentz, and this is always my favorite one to ask, and that is, what does being well and strong mean to you?
I think being well and strong means having the clarity and the balance in your life to be able to do things that you enjoy and pursue. It's being able to show up for people you care about. It's being able to show up for things you care about. it's not being bedridden, and it's about not being dictated by your health, right? It's not letting your poor health affect your ability to live your best life.
Yeah, I love that. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your time. You're such a sweetheart. I'm really looking forward to sharing this. And yeah, I hope to have you on again at some point soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.